Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Roanoke College Alumni Association NOKELive series. We are holding these weekly live events throughout the summer and include a mixture of webinars, film and book discussions, and so much more. Please visit the Alumni Hub page on our Roanoke College website, and you can find that by visiting roanoke.edu/alumni. My name is Sally Logan Walker, and I serve here at the college as the Director of Alumni and Donor Relations, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. Before we begin our conversation, I want to just cover a couple logistical points. We would love to know who is here with us tonight viewing via YouTube, so you can use the chat feature to let us know that you're on. And you can also use the chat feature throughout the evening to present questions to us. We will attempt to cover as many questions with our presenters as possible. Can't promise we're going to get through all of them, but we will give it a shot. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Alumni Hub and on this YouTube channel beginning tomorrow. So during tonight's event, our presenters will discuss race in both ideological and historical frameworks. The presentations will address some of the ways in which debates about race intersect with notions of human rights, techniques of political power, and questions about the meaning of history. It is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters. Dr. Jesse Bucher is an associate professor of history, director of the Center for Studying Structures of Race, and coordinator of the African and African Diaspora Studies concentration at Roanoke College. He has a doctorate in African history from University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where he was a MacArthur Scholar at the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change. Prior to coming to join us at Roanoke College, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape. Dr. Bucher has worked on projects related to histories of public commemoration, memorialization, and monuments. At Roanoke College, he regularly offers courses on history of slavery, on African history, and on Black political movements throughout Africa. Dr. Joshua Rubingoya is a professor of political science and former chair of the Department of Public Affairs at Roanoke College. He holds a MA and a doctorate in international politics from the University of Denver in Denver, Colorado, and a Bachelor of Arts with honors from Makerere University in Uganda. I hope I said that correctly. He is the author of multiple published works such as Homogenic Political Regimes in Africa and Regime Homogeny in, you're going to have to help me, Dr. Rubingoya, Museveni's?
Yes, Museveni's
Uganda. Among his honorary recognitions, Dr. Rubingoya was a Fulbright Scholar. Prior to coming to the United States, Dr. Rubingoya was a journalist in Uganda, where he served as news anchor on Radio Uganda and Uganda Television. So at this time, let me please welcome both of our presenters, Drs. Bucher and Rubingoya, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. And I'll be presenting first. So welcome everybody. It's good to see you, even if I can't see you, but I'm glad to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to present today on the topic of race as history. So I'll start with a few questions. What does it mean to think about race and history together? What is a racist history? What makes certain histories racist? And how do some histories carry out the work of racism? Second, how do we most effectively tell the history of race and racism? How do we examine the ways in which race as a category gets constructed? And how do we understand the power of race? To approach these questions, I'll present to you a history of the Confederate Monument that currently rests on the Roanoke College campus in front of West Hall. I will argue that the monument itself, its construction, display, and its continued presence demonstrate the overlap between racist histories and a history of race. By normalizing and indeed retelling a racist history, this Confederate monument sustains racist structures of power. Let me begin with racist monuments as race histories. In 1987, Roanoke College purchased the old Roanoke County Courthouse and converted it into West Hall. Many of you who are attending this event today likely took classes or met with your professors in West Hall. The property sale included two caveats. First, since the building itself appears on the National Register of Historic Places, the college has had to maintain many of the original historical details of the actual building. Second, and more importantly, the plot of land containing Roanoke County's 1910 Confederate Monument was never included in the 1987 purchase agreement. Since 1987, the county has continued to own the deed to this small but deeply significant space. The land and the 28 feet of granite that form the Confederate Monument remain under the control of Roanoke County. Yet for anyone who visits or attends Roanoke College, the monument is an unavoidable landmark. It casts a long shadow, physically and figuratively, on our community. By default, we are responsible for telling the monument's history. The story of that Confederate monument, its history, is a racist history. It is also a history of race. Let me begin my explanation by describing a public celebration and a dramatic unveiling ceremony. On June 3rd, 1910, 5,000 people gathered in Salem, Virginia, to officially celebrate the opening of the newly constructed Roanoke County Courthouse at the corner of Main Street and College Lane. Designed by H.H. Huggins, the neoclassical courthouse was built by King Lumber Company of Charlottesville for a price of $43,870. It replaced an older brick building courthouse built in 1841. The entire process of demolishing the old courthouse and replacing it with the new building took just over a year. In addition to celebrating the completion of the new courthouse, the main event on June 3rd, Jefferson Davis's birthday, coincided with the dramatic unveiling of a brand new Confederate monument. The local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy had raised funds and purchased the monument, carved from granite that came from a quarry in Vermont, to commemorate the white Roanoke County residents who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. The monument's pedestal was located on the exact spot where Roanoke County residents signed up to join the Salem Artillery Battery in 1861. This is the same plot of land that the county continues to own to this day. The unveiling ceremony culminated when members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, dressed all in white, simultaneously pulled 26 ribbons, 26 being a reference to Confederate Memorial Day, April 26, and unveiled the newly acquired monument to the 5,000-person crowd. While it is true that the United Daughters of the Confederacy were making an effort to honor relatives, friends, and neighbors who fought in the Civil War, we can also say with confidence that they took part in a coordinated effort to tell a racist history. There are many places to display a monument to the war dead. Cemeteries across our country, indeed across the world, that contain remains of veterans are an excellent example of this. But the Confederate monument erected in Salem was not placed in a cemetery. It was placed right in the middle of town, a sentinel standing in front of the brand new courthouse, a building supposedly put up to publicly reinforce the law. The monument stood across the street from the local bank. The town's new streetcars, which rode up College Lane before turning down Main Street, would have slowly passed beneath and in full view of the monument. It was a carefully chosen location. More to the point, the history that the monument asserted was not just about preserving memory about the soldiers who died in the war. It was about reclaiming the lost cause mythology about the Confederacy. It was part of a larger process of publicly performing a concept of whiteness. The monument in Salem does not have any text that says, for example, the Confederate States of America committed treason and lost. Instead, it normalizes the idea that Confederate soldiers were part of a just cause. To any viewer, the presence of this monument commemorates a victory rather than a defeat. So what then was the victory that was being celebrated in Salem? To a large extent, the victory achieved was the defeat of Reconstruction, the vast implementation of racial segregation, and the effectiveness of unrestricted racial violence directed at African Americans across large parts of the country. This period of Virginia history, part of what scholar Henry Louis Gates calls the redemption against Reconstruction, saw the cementing of political and economic power in the hands of white Virginians. The choice of speakers for the ceremony on June 3rd reinforces this point. Speakers included both former governor of Virginia, Claude Swanson, as well as William Ballard, a Confederate veteran who previously served as superintendent of schools and the Commonwealth's attorney for Roanoke County. Swanson and Ballard were the sorts of public officials who had recently implemented policies that entrenched practices of segregation. Moreover, these men helped open a courthouse that was presided over by Judge William Walter Moffett. Moffett, who was also a member of the Roanoke College Board of Trustees, was deeply interested in a racist version of Southern history that conformed to the lowest standards of the lost cause mythology. When the courthouse was first built and opened for business before the June ceremony, Moffett signed an order mandating that the first day of court business on April 1st would only include the reading of sketches about, quote, prominent citizens, statesmen, and soldiers. Moffett knew better than most that the coordination of official power and official history could shape public discourse. It comes as no surprise then that a year later, Moffett caused massive turmoil at Roanoke College and indeed the entire town and county when he objected to Professor Thorstensberg's decision to assign Henry Elson's book, History of the United States. The book contained information about the history of the Civil War, namely the role of slavery as the reason for secession, that did not reconcile with the lost cause mythology Moffett wanted to hear. Moffett threatened the college, called for the book's banning, and eventually resigned as a board member. As a purveyor of racist histories, Moffett could not be part of an institution that raised critical questions about the past. In all of these activities, fundraising for a monument, placing it at the center of a growing town, celebrating the solidification of white supremacy, the telling of history became an essential mechanism for reinforcing very specific relationships between power, violence, and intimidation. The Confederate Monument tells a story about race, but also acts in the service of racial power. It arrived as white citizens in Virginia enacted white supremacy through all channels of civic life. It told these people that they were right to celebrate their whiteness, and it gave them public means for telling this history. In 1913, 3 years after the monument appeared, town officials in Salem voted 5-0 to implement a law from the Virginia General Assembly that allowed the town to create racially segregated districts. On November 6, 1913, the town created 2 housing districts, one for African Americans and another for the town's white residents. The laws made it all but impossible for African Americans to acquire new property in Salem, and likely played a significant role in the declining numbers of African American residents in Salem between the 1910 and 1920 censuses, when the African American population dropped from 840 to 618, while the white population increased from 2,999 to approximately 3,500. These patterns of exclusion continued across the following decades and are still present today. So it is that today, more than ever, we have an essential, so today, more than ever, it is essential that we consider the historical significance of the plot of land, this emblem of white supremacy that the monument rests on. More than ever, we must treat this plot of land for what it is, the island home of a racist history. Here comes it. Our college is dedicated to thinking about its own history of race. We are finding outlets to tell less understood parts of our story. We want to know the role that enslaved people played in constructing the college. We want to know and understand our complicity in the Confederate cause. We want to realize that our college grew alongside a tacit acceptance of segregation, and we want to address our continuing struggles to meet our stated goals for a more diverse campus community. Above all, and here's my key point, Roanoke College is willing to consider the history of race. We are taking a critical stance on race and refusing to get swept up in the sort of racist histories that treat Confederate soldiers and monuments as cold, innocent stone. Racist histories that go unchecked perpetuate false myths about the past. They are intellectually dishonest, perpetuate inequity, and diminish our capacity to use history to affect positive change. Roanoke County may decide to keep the Confederate monument in place, and in so doing, they would remain in compliance with the state laws of Virginia. But the Roanoke College community, the community that lives and has lived alongside the monument on a daily basis, can do its part to rethink the relationship between history and race. We, as a community of people that care about and are invested in Roanoke College and its values, can ensure that the monument remains on an island. We will choose to tell histories of race, its construction, its ceremonies, its commemorations, and in so doing, we will take power away from racist histories. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Booker, for your great insights in your presentation. And thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to participate in this worthy cause. I want this evening to address 3 main points and a 4th concluding one. The first is to try, in this very short period, to define what race is. That's the challenge. And then explain what ideology is. The third mission for me this evening is to investigate the intersection between ideology and race, and then conclude with how human rights discourses and debates help us to add quality to this conversation. We begin by admitting that race is not a biological or even a scientific category. It is rather a cultural political abstraction. It's a socio-political construct. It's a mental design in which arbitrary characteristics like skin color, hair, eyes, and other cultural traits are used to create difference. These characteristics are used to suggest supposedly irreconcilable distinctions between the self and the other. Ultimately, these differences are used in the allocation of economic, political, legal, and social privilege through institutionalized normative structures that we otherwise call laws. And it is in this regard that tensions arise and conflicts emerge. But what are we to make of this notion of race as a social construction? Why do certain sections of a society go about processes of social construction? In this case, constructions of race as category of identity. These questions call for a more critical examination, I argue, of what I have called ideology. First, ideology denotes a set of systematically organized philosophical and political ideas meant for transforming, rearranging, and directing society toward a world or future that they consider to be ideal. The ideal world itself is in the imagination of those wedded to or constructing the ideologies in question. So in some quarters, white privilege, for example, is imagined as idyllic, and its demise, is viewed as the epitome of the fallen world. But this dynamic takes on a zero-sum game of sorts. Granting equality to non-whites is viewed as having a diminishing effect on the status and position of whites. This essentially turns the meaning of civil rights on its head. The second component of ideology is that it stands to reason that the architects of ideologies always begin by critiquing the present, the status quo. So, for example, Karl Marx and Engels and Lenin first observed what in their minds were the abhorrent effects of capitalism, and they then proffered first a critique of it, and then a systematic set of propositions for doing away with it. So socialism was the ideological orientation designed to bring about a revolutionary shift from the market-driven and profit-motivated economic and political institutions of the late 18th or 19th century. The likes of Adam Smith articulated an ideology championing the virtues of capitalism, and more particularly, the magical wonders of the market. So, history records that some ideologies are emancipatory, while others are marginalizing. Some are change-oriented, and others advocate for the status quo. They are conservative. Finally, ideologies are always rooted in some sort of theory about human nature. And this is important for our conversation this evening. How we perceive and define human nature impacts everything and everything else, and particularly in the social and political domain. Are we by nature selfish, egotistical beings, or are we loving and selfless? Or, as John Locke, the English philosopher, suggested, are we by nature characterized by reason and tolerance? In the United States, the early constructions of race engaged the notion that Blacks were not human at all. In his subjugation of the natives of Latin America, the conquistador made the same ideological claim and even received backing from the Vatican. Way before George Floyd, indigenous peoples cried out in sometimes loud, sometimes soft tones for an opportunity to breathe as the imperialist knee exerted the heavy weight of exploitation and alienation. The remnants of this sort of dehumanization have remained at the core of race as a category or ideology of oppression in the world and in the United States in particular. The preservation of privilege is at the intersection of race and ideology. Whether it is the plantation economy of the American South or of the Caribbean, the ideology of race was instrumental in maximizing material gain through the exploitation of labor. It perpetuates privilege along racial lines. When race as ideology becomes the lens through which the world is viewed, we must also unpack race as a form of power. Power exercised by the historically dominant social stratum. And in historical terms, this power is manifest in imperialist conquests in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia. These adventures were driven by ideological dicta like the white man's burden or manifest destiny. Now, the lighter versions of these ideological frames include notions such as American exceptionalism or American exemptionalism, ideas that I can explain later during the question time. The legal, political manifestations of these ideologies in the United States rest in institutionalized segregation, Jim Crow laws, and the more subtle systemic forms of that are embedded in contemporary financial, educational, housing, policing, and other related institutions. So the Confederate Monument stand as the imprimatur of race as ideology. Let's talk about a solution that I believe is embedded in the language and movement of human rights. The human rights perspective regarding the question of race as ideology offers a reasonable and productive resolution. Human rights discourses begin from the perspective of entitlements that are claimed by humans as humans. So the premise of human dissolves all other arbitrary or constructed reference or identity categories such as nationality, gender, race, etc. So human rights engage key claims. A, that all humans need to live a life of dignity because it's what defines us. B, that entitlements, i.e. rights, are exercised, claimed, and enjoyed strictly and only from the perspective of being human. C, that they are not granted by the state or community and therefore cannot be denied or withdrawn. And D, that to the degree that we are all human, a life of dignity is one underpinned by notions of equality. So clearly, debates concerning human rights cannot withstand frames such as white or black or brown or woman or man. These categories are epiphenomenal, they are superficial, they are conceptualized to essentially reinforce notions of privilege for given categories of people. Now, let us contrast that. Let us contrast the human rights debate. Because in contrast to human rights, race as ideology begins from the opposite side of the continuum. It takes dehumanization as its point of departure. This perspective is ideological in that it critiques the present, makes assumptions about human nature, and articulates visions of an ideal world, all of which lead to the justification and rationalization and legitimization of abuse, of lynchings, of summary executions, of unjust incarceration, of rape, etc. In one word, these are ideologies that underpin racism. Now, racism develops cultural roots, often as an outcome of a people's history, and how this history both informs and shapes institutions. When race becomes organic and pervasive, it is both insidious and pernicious. It is insidious in that it corrodes the very people and institutions that harbor the ideology of race. And I selected this word, pernicious, because it has and provides some poignancy. The corrosion of race has a complex dynamic. It destroys the racist at the same time that it devastates the victim of racism. The victim suffers from ignominy of alienation, marginalization, and dehumanization. The racist experiences shame, self-hate, and guilt. Finally, in its essence, race as ideology is intrinsically pernicious. In other words, it's injurious, ruinous, and deadly to the community in which it is allowed to fester. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You've both given us so much to think about. And while we wait for questions from our viewers, I was wondering, Dr. Bucher, do you have a question that you wanted to address?
Sure. While we're waiting for others to come in, I'm always happy to talk to my colleague, Dr. Mumbai.
Thank you.
So one of the interesting things is that we have a comparison of founding documents. The one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that sort of spells out the methodology for thinking about human rights or implementing it. And then we have the American Constitution, which is both laws that are enacted, but then also a section on question of rights. So I was just going to ask you to compare those two a bit. I mean, should we see the UDHR as something that could be the necessary supplement to the Constitution, or a starting point for a rethinking of the Constitution itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because Eleanor Roosevelt was very critical and important in the design and the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she argued that the ideals and norms and values that were invested in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were already kind of embedded in the United States Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence itself. So the argument then was that in putting together such a declaration, that critical American values and ideals would become universal, that they would appeal and apply to all peoples. But at the same time, what wasn't debated at the time was that the ideals that were embedded in the Constitution and the Declaration had a particular category of people in mind. That there was a definition of we the people in a manner that was somewhat restrictive. So when the civil rights movement begins, what Martin Luther King Jr. and others are arguing is the expansion of the notion of we the people. That the civil rights movement and the notion of equality was embedded in the principles of the Constitution only if we could expand our definition of we the people, and then perhaps weave that into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, creating a universal humanity and a humanity that was beyond color or creed or gender, etc., etc. So I think what the journey has been for the American people and for peoples around the world has been, how do we reconcile those ideas? How do we reconcile the ideals of the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and all the international legal norms that have kind of come out of the human rights movement? Unfortunately, because of a concept that I addressed earlier, this notion of American exceptionalism, the United States, in fact, has ratified very few of the global human rights laws because of this notion of exceptionalism, that because the American Constitution and Declaration of Human Rights, rather the American Constitution and the Independence Declaration have these high-sounding, wonderful ideals, it therefore doesn't see itself as being held privy to, and therefore having a duty to ratify the human rights notions and ideals. So that then there's this narrow definition that, you know, these remain as part and parcel of the American political culture, but that the United States has no obligation to then sign on to the global norms and laws and conventions that we hold dear. So again, we see here the United States, on the one hand, championing the notion of liberty, of freedom, etc., but saying that because we have these championed and rooted in our Constitution, we have no duty to sign on to the global conventions. And therefore, it still leaves the United States outside of what most of the developed world considers to be accepted norms of guiding and shaping human expectations and dreams. So I'm going to return the question perhaps to you, and I found your presentation insightful in the sense that it is by understanding the history of these monuments that we then can get a sense of the symbolism and the meaning and the debates that exist today in the post-Floyd era, although these are debates that precede that, of course. But I guess my question is, what is it that underpins the different readings of our history, and what it means, and how history must move forward in ways that are constructive and emancipatory?
Mm-hmm. So I actually wrote a longer version of this and then edited it back. And the longer version really was beginning to ask what the long-term relationship between race and history has been. Which is to say, if we take something like history as a discipline, as a field of study, we can say that it emerged at the same moment in the early 19th century when the scientific revolution was producing categories of race of the sort that you described.
Mm-hmm.
Monogenesis, polygenesis, these different theories that use science to explain the differences around the observed category that was created, race. And so one of the questions that I was asking in other version of this, but indeed in all the classes that I teach at the college, it's essentially, is history as a discipline up to the task of rethinking the category of race? Or has there always been a relationship between history and race? If race is a modern concept and history is a modern discipline, what work do we have to do to separate them? And you see versions of that, I think, in how people talk about something like a monument, so that it's carried out in the supposedly neutral scientific method of history writing, and that it's so normalized the patterns of relationship with race that you just neglect that it's there altogether. So that you could tell a history of soldiers and just claim that this is a race neutral object, or it's a race neutral notion of the historic past, and that far from that, it is part and parcel of a history of race.
Yeah, and I find that fascinating, because I think what you're also saying is that history can be understood as ideology. In other words, as a narrative that is intended to exercise and even impose power and privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the intersection, perhaps, of our presentations tonight, which is to say that who tells history, how it is told, but more importantly, in whose interest and at whose behest, either allows it to be scientific in a way, and therefore much more empirical, or ideological. In other words, intended to strengthen, to even underpin certain positions of class, of privilege and of subjugation.
Mhm.
So, and
Sally,
then of course,
there's questions there, Sally. Do you want us to?
Yes, well, I think one question is just expanding on this discussion you're having. We're seeing lots reaction, not just with monuments. We're seeing name changes just right up the road, Washington and Lee University. You know, if each of you wanted just to comment on that a little bit in a similar context.
sure. Dr. Booker, do you want to go first on that one as well?
Sure. So I saw a question on the side. I'll answer about the statue, and then I'll expand out onto the monument.
Okay.
So the question that was here in front of me is the timeline that Roanoke County has or has not provided for considering movement of the statue. It has come up at a Board of Supervisors meeting, but there has been no official announcement by the Roanoke County of any plan to convene hearings. So if you look at the July 1st law that exists in the state of Virginia, it's a series of 30-day notices. A county has to make the announcement of 30 days to gather public opinion, and then another 30 days to decide on a location for the monument. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen either of those processes yet start. The larger question was about name changes, not just the removal of monuments, but also really widening that scope to think about namesakes. So Washington and Lee being a really prominent example of that. And so this is just thinking about that question. It's a important process that you can really think of as in multiple phases. So the most important thing, no matter what the outcomes of these questions are, is that we are having these conversations. And these are vital conversations that really do have to take place. I'll give my opinion on it. So any institution that changes its name, any building that has its name changed, the institution that changes the name, both if it's the whole college or a building on a campus, has to make sure that they're not getting a free pass just to change the name and then move forward. What we need is a broader reconciliation with history itself. Why was that name chosen in the first place? Whose interests were represented when the name was selected? What name are you going to put on it afterward? And then how do you still continue to tell the story of your past and be responsible for that as you move into the future? So this isn't just a avenue of just sort of clearing out the past and then moving forward in the way that you want. It's a complicated process, and it's one that has to take place.
Right, and I'm not sure I have much to add to that. Because we see changes such as the Redskins, changing their name, and it seems to me there's kind of a reckoning of sorts as to how these names came to be and what the purpose was, and it seems to me that there's a sensitivity towards what motivated these kinds of naming processes and their place in history. So, to the extent that the profile of such names and such references in history has become so important, not only in the discourse, but also that this kind of change is taking place, then we can perhaps have an optimism of sorts as to where the country is going. But we must also beware that while this is going on, there are countervailing forces as well, that this is only perhaps the beginning of the undoing of a history that has, generally speaking, been somewhat demeaning and racist toward those who are in the minority.
And Sally, I see there was a follow-up on that one. So it's basically asking, how can people that are current students, people that were in the campus in the past, how can you express unhappiness about its presence? So if you're a citizen of Roanoke County, there is a civic process that is underway. So that entails petitioning the Board of Supervisors to make yourself heard. We're also trying to develop some things through the Center for Studying Structures of Race as of providing an outlet for students and alumni of the college to make themselves heard, to talk about the experience of studying alongside or within proximity to the Confederate Monument, what it's meant to people, how it's impacted them emotionally, what it's done for their sense of well-being, and even their sense of belonging at the college. And our goal is really to continue to do that work over the long term, to create an outlet that people can be heard and have their voices felt, and then make some digital or in-person exhibits, depending on what the pandemic permits, of really displaying some of the feedback that we get from our college community.
We had a specific question for you, Dr. Bucher. Would you talk about the role the UDC played in putting textbooks in the public schools and how you think that affected students reading them?
Yeah, I mean, so this effort to instill the myth of the lost cause, it didn't just stop with a public monument. I'll use the word that Dr. Ruben Goya did earlier. This was an insidious campaign to make sure that the story wasn't just told in the venue of the public town square, but that it was also an essential part of the education of young Virginians and people across the South, and to an extent in northern states as well. I have my bookshelf here. It's my grandmother's 1920. She was born in Virginia, 1920 history of Virginia. And so it has all of the lost cause imagery that you would expect. It's fully dressed people of African descent arriving in Virginia to open arms of plantation holders. It treats slavery as an innocent event, as part of a gift that was given to people of African descent. And that mythology lingered for a really long time. And it was backed up institutionally with educational boards and with state leadership that maintained official segregation well beyond the 1950s. So with the great resistance to school integration that stretched into the 1960s and beyond. I mean, this was a systematic, coordinated effort to really mislead people about the truth of regional history.
Thank you. So that question was from Joanne Casulo. Thank you, Joanne, for that question. We have a couple others that have come in from Andrew Stumfels. This is a question for both our presenters. For those viewing tonight, what one thing can we as individual citizens do to make a difference? Pick one. That's hard, isn't it?
It is hard, and I hate to respond to this as an aphorism because it really does require deep thought. But the aphorism is that that we need to do, or to be the change. We need to do those things that provide the change that we want to see. And oftentimes, the change begins with each individual citizen. What is the responsibility of citizenship with respect to social change? And Professor Bucher and I can sit here and talk and give these kinds of conversations, but at the end of the day, is racism rooted in the hearts and minds of our people? If the answer is yes, and I would agree that not all, of course, but that there are those people who have it in their hearts and in their minds, and that these debates go on, and so each individual then must become the change that they wish to see. Meaning that I understand it as a responsibility of citizenship to be the change that you want to see. Well, what does that mean? It means taking action where action is required. Activism is perhaps so crucial to the American political culture. And so today we have various forms and platforms through which we can begin to bring about the change that we see and that we feel is reasonable, is expected, perhaps, and is even overdue. So it's a grassroots kind of process, I think, and it begins with each individual becoming the change that they want to see. By the way, Andrew, thank you very much. Andrew was my student. I remember him very vividly.
I'll add just two. One is not to give in to easy answers on things. It's a complicated world. And the other is not to trust anybody that has power.
Good answers. Okay, let's see. We've had a few more come in. Dr. Ruben Goya, can you expand more on American exceptionalism and our obsession with liberty and freedom? Do you believe we are capable of shifting our perspective that human rights are almost exclusively about liberty and freedom, even when this comes at the expense of others?
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, the idea here of American exceptionalism is quite pronounced, especially in American foreign policy, because it manifests itself in how the United States frames policies abroad. And so we've had, as a country, we've had the practice of championing and even popularizing notions of liberty, of freedom, of rights, of the rule of law in the United States, even though in the last couple of years we might also question that. But typically and historically, what has happened is that we champion these at home, but we act, as a country, we act differently abroad. So that when it comes, as I was arguing earlier, when it comes to signing key important human rights conventions and laws, we have said, no, we are the exception. We already have them at home, so we have no obligation and duty in the affairs of our country as it performs its duties abroad. So, for example, the notion of manifest destiny, it's a principle that says that the United States has this duty globally to enlighten those who are perceived to be less wedded to the notions of liberty, of freedom, and so on, as understood in the American context. And yet we find that wherever, especially in the Cold War, that wherever a people have elected a leader using their means, their processes of free and fair elections, if that leader has been unacceptable in Washington, as a country, we have not hesitated to topple and remove that leader. And so we then have this double standard where we claim we have all these rights at home, but our foreign policy abroad has been, in a lot of cases, atrocious. I was watching a documentary yesterday on Iraq, and we remember the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where there is torture, where there are all kinds of practices like waterboarding, etc., that are atrocious and could never be legitimized inside the United States, at least based on American legal jurisprudence. Then we have this interesting notion that if we have an international criminal court, the United States argues we're not going to be party to the Rome Treaty, which underpins the International Criminal Court. Why? Because we already have these rights and liberties at home, so we are an exception. Or we should be exempted. That's the American exemptionalism component of it. We should be exempted from duties and obligations of the International Criminal Court. But this is a court that is put up to say, look, if there are human rights abusers around the world, especially in leadership positions, as Dr. Buka was saying, be very, very cautious about people in power. But if people in power are abusive, they ought to be brought to they ought to be held responsible for their atrocities, for their activities. And for the United States not to sign and to be party to the Rome Statute means that a message is being sent abroad that we are not, in fact, wedded to these ideals and these norms globally. So we take ourselves to be exceptions in this regard. And what then has become really problematic is that when tear gas and other forms of force are used in Washington, as recently was the case, it leaves the United States in a very problematic position, because the US then cannot tell China not to use tear gas or water cannon on demonstrators in Hong Kong. That is the conundrum that we find ourselves in today.
Sally, do you want me to do this question on the screen?
So,
About the displaying of photos and material in the archive.
yes, did you see the context of, this is from Ashley Ann, who is an alumnus. I'll go ahead and just kind of frame the question. She made a comment first that as a student from New Hampshire, from up north, her first experience was the statue and seeing a Confederate flag down here on campus. And so she then asked the question, will the college ever display the photos and materials in the Roanoke archive that depict historical moments of racist history as an educational exhibit for students and the community at large?
So the answer is yes. I mean, this is in our plans, is really as we're retelling the history of the college, that we're accountable for all phases of the college's history. So this isn't just the period in the 19th century when the college was using slave labor to build its first buildings, but this is a story that continued well into the 20th century in various forms up to the present day. So I think the photos that she's probably referring to are events like parties or performances where people were in blackface, antebellum themed, like plantation themed parties that would have gone on, different events where the Confederate flag was officially flown as on campus. And so those kinds of archival records that we have tell the very extroverted form when that was, tacitly sanctioned by the college, but it also continues to be flown at other times and appear in other places. And that is an essential step that needs to be taken of making sure that that's not allowed to continue.
Dr. Rubengoya, did you want to respond? Any thoughts on that last question? You're on mute.
I think it's a very good question, and Dr. Buka's response is indeed apropos here, because as an educational institution, our objective is not to obscure what the history of the college has been, but rather to be transparent and very clear about what the history of the college has been, and to be very intentional in articulating what the flaws of that history are, and what it has meant and what it did mean, and then also use these moments of teaching to project what a free and liberal society ought to look like. So we have to do perhaps what the Germans have done. And when I took students the other semester to Germany, we found that the Germans are very open about this period of the Nazi period, that the concentration camps are open, that the discussion is open and transparent, that they have come to terms as we must come to terms. But to do that, we must not and ought not to obscure the history, but rather to see it as it is, and then to use it in ways that construct new ways of understanding history and of framing the future.
Well, thank you both for responding to that last question. And in lieu of time, I think we are going to conclude our conversation. I want to thank you both for taking time to be with us this evening. I want to thank all of our viewers out there who joined us tonight and took time to hear our comments and help us as we reflect. I invite you to come to each of our NOKELive events this summer. And we have 2 upcoming to close out the month of July. Next Friday, we will be joined by the Fintel family, and they will be taking a look at Dr. Norm Fintel's book that he had begun writing with his daughter, Barb Collins, helped finish that book, and it's called Love Norm. And I think that the Fintel family will be joining us, and we'll have a wonderful conversation about Love Norm and Norm and Joe, and not just their time at Roanoke College, but just little stories and conversations about Norm and Joe. And then our last event will be on July 29th in the evening, and our Outdoor Adventure Center program is going to join us, and we're going to take a look at 3 different movies, and we encourage you to watch at least one of them and join us for a really lively, fun discussion about outdoor adventure. All that information is available on our website at roanoke.edu/alumni. It's all on the Alumni Hub. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening.
Sally, thank you so much for organizing and arranging these events. I think they are so important of the college and of those who have attended this institution.
Wonderful.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.